architect and climate activist, who's going to talk to us about disruption and design. I think that's all we need to know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Vicky. And thanks everyone for coming out on a pretty horrible evening. And it's a real privilege and honor to be here at the institution giving this talk. So as Vicky says, I'm going to be talking about sort of a little bit of disruption and provocation, and hopefully be speaking for about an hour, and then we'll have sort of time for discussion afterwards. I was invited originally to talk about climate, and I've kind of widened it a little bit, and I've sneaked in there about nature as well, which is a passion of mine, and it's so interlinked with climate, so I'm going to be covering that as well. So I've got quite a lot of slides to get through, so I'm going to go at some pace. I'm sure many of you will know who that is, Caroline Lucas. I think she's the MP, the Green MP for Brighton. And I came across on her Twitter profile, she has at sort of the end of it, a better world is possible, let's make it happen. And I thought that was just such a great, concise way to put the whole issue. So that sense of we need to imagine a better future, but not just that, we actually need to make it happen. It's not just a case of sort of waiting for things to get better. We need to actively be part of that process of making it better. You're probably wondering why I've got a picture of Kim Kardashian on the screen there. The reason is because I want to make the point that she's an influencer, whatever that is, but we're all influencers in our own way. So if you think about, say, going to the supermarket, what you choose, whether it's seasonal, whether it's local, how it's packaged, where it's sourced from, all of those have a much bigger impact. So our choices are influencing lots of things. And there's a whole kind of sliding scale from being quite passive, say, just as a consumer, through to, you know, the other end of the spectrum, being a protester. And we don't necessarily need to be right at this end, but in between, we can still have an influence and have an impact. And incidentally, that's, I haven't sort of really said, but I'm from Stride Treglown. We're an architect practice. Locally, our headquarters is in Bristol, and that's one of our supermarkets, which is a timber frame supermarket, which is a possible thing, and we should be doing more of them. So in terms of having influence, there's Dan Burgess, if you've not come across him, he's sort of an environmental activist in Bath and happens to be one of my neighbours. And he has a podcast called Spaceship Earth, and kind of becoming crew is one of his sort of almost strap lines. And what he's trying to say is just sort of like in the last slide, we can choose to be sort of passengers or crew to sort of steer our way to a better future. And so it's sort of up to us how much we want to be involved to make that better future. And in terms of what we do, I'm sure many of you would have come across this book, which came out sort of about maybe 15 years ago now. And when it did, it had a really kind of strong impact on me. And there was one chapter in particular called Not Just Less Bad, but Good. And it was all about, I think up until that point, there'd been very much a kind of sense that sustainability was about doing things less, having less impact. And it sort of flipped it all on its head. It said that we should actually be striving to have not just a less bad impact, but a positive impact. And I think that's a really kind of, well, a whole direction that's been really embraced in recent years. And so the whole kind of term of sustainability is almost sort of becoming a bit outdated, because sustainability is just about maintaining what there is now. And it's sort of only just marginally better than being less bad. And what there's a lot of movement towards now, which many of you be probably familiar with, is something called regenerative design. So that's all about having a positive impact. And it also applies and is, you know, if you look for that sort of language, you can see it in all aspects of sustainability. So if you think about nature and our kind of our use of the land, we were very much always talking about nature conservation. So that's a kind of less bad approach to it. So where we've got species and we don't want to do any more harm to them, so we're trying to conserve what we've got. What we're talking about these days is much more nature restoration. So we're recognizing, like in those really quite frightening statistics up in the top left there, that actually nature's in a really terrible place. And it's not just a case of doing less bad anymore. We need to be improving it and doing much better. And I'm not sure, have many of you come across a place called the Knepp Estate in Sussex? Yeah. So that's, it's a farm which is doing some really interesting things. And what they've done is they're still a farm, they're still producing meat and food, but they're doing it in a very different way. So they've kind of rewilded their estate. And you can see from this was just a screen grab I did from Google Earth, just to see in the middle there, the sort of different sort of landscape. So they're actually kind of returning it to nature and doing it in a much more kind of positive way. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. I'm also just going to cover this a little bit. I really like this quote from Einstein where he talks about imagination being much more sort of powerful and useful than knowledge. And I think it goes back to that kind of Caroline, what she was saying at the start, about imagining a positive future and the kind of the power of that. And that's going to be a sort of theme running through the talk. So it's a little bit of a kind of a trot through some of my projects and the kind of evolution of how this approach has sort of manifested through some of my work. And I was very fortunate to work in Australia during my part of my architectural training. And I worked in a practice with a guy who is very much a kind of ideas man. And he brought me along to this meeting, which was, he had this idea there was this kind of empty, large strip of pavement outside the office or just around the corner from it. And it was in front of a blank bit of wall, which was to a car park. And he said, what we want to do is put an old railway carriage on this big strip of pavement and turn it into a cafe. And it was a bit of a crazy idea. And he brought me along to meet the landowner who he'd found out. And he pitched this idea to them. And the guys listened to him and said, yeah, that's a very interesting thing. I don't think it's probably something for us. And so we're like, okay, fair enough. Well, 3 months later, a cafe popped up in exactly that place. So although it wasn't us who, the actual idea didn't happen, something triggered and the idea generated something else. And that's kind of a bit of a theme I want to explore, is that idea of proposing something and then things might happen as a result of that. So it's being proactive and being provocative as well. And when I came back to the UK and I joined Stride Treglown in Bristol, this was a place where I'd quite often go for my lunches, which is the observatory. And I learned that the observatory used to be a windmill, and it got me thinking about that. And I realized, it was obviously a windmill because it was in a very suitable place for wind. It's very exposed up there. And it was just at the time when Bristol was trying to sort of thinking about being green capital. And we put together a proposal to say, what if we put a wind turbine, not next to the observatory, but slightly further along in the downs? That would be like a great advert for Bristol as a green capital. It would get people thinking about onshore wind. And it was at a time when sort of wind was just beginning to get a bit of, wind power beginning to get a bit of momentum, but there was a lot of nervousness about it from the general public. And so it'd be a way of, within a large population, of putting a wind turbine, people would be able to go and visit it and maybe go, well, actually, maybe it's not as bad as I thought. So it'd be a visitor attraction. It'd be next to the zoo. So we put this idea out there, and Ecotricity were very interested, and they did some measurements and they found that the site was very good in terms of wind. So it was a real realistic proposal, and it was just kind of in the middle of the picture there, if you can just read where it says Clifton Downs. And they sort of confirmed that, you could probably power sort of 1,500 homes from that wind turbine. And, we put some imagery together to show how it could be a tourist attraction as well. And we suggested that, this is actually a turbine in Swaffham in Suffolk, I think, which I've been to, and you can climb up a spiral staircase all the way up to the top, and there's an observation deck there. So it's a brilliant idea, and they've put it like an environmental centre next door to it, which was something we said could be explored as well. And it generated a whole load of interest, and we knew it was always a bit of a far-fetched idea. But we just weren't sure what was going to happen with it, and went and met various people. Met the vice mayor at the time, who kind of nodded and wasn't sure about it. And after the meeting, he went straight to the press and said, "This is an abomination." And we were on TV and we got radio interviews as well. And but it actually generated a whole load of discussion and thought about onshore wind. And in fact, the newspaper did a poll and it came out about sort of 50-50 in support and against. And that was sort of back in 2008, which I think was quite encouraging, really, for such a kind of controversial location. And what's interesting now is that, wind is a lot more supported and accepted. And although there's not really policies in place to support onshore wind, this is something exciting which is happening in Avonmouth, just next door, where they are, if you don't know, building the UK's largest wind turbine, which will power 3,000 homes, and it will be community owned as well. So that's a really positive story happening right now. And a few years later, we were discussing about, generating discussion, and someone also suggested, so our office in Bristol is right in the centre by that white circle. What if we put a planning application in to put a wind turbine in the garden of our office? It would never happen, but the amount of sort of discussion it would create would again be a really good prompt to kind of get people talking about it. So I was fortunate to be made head of sustainability in our practice about sort of 10, 11 years ago. And so one of the first things I suggested was maybe we start having some green weeks in the office. And this is an opportunity for staff to kind of talk about green issues and to influence others and sort of have a bit of fun and propose things. And I think that this was the first year we decided to green over temporarily some parking spaces, a bit like the kind of parklets that you see. And this was our chairman who gave up his space and was walking in instead. And it was a really good way of actually provoking discussion to visitors to the building. And we actually have a little car park next to the office, and we had a vote, and staff voted to not drive in during the week and turn it into a football pitch. And it was great. And suddenly the car park serving sort of 10 staff suddenly became something for everyone to enjoy. And again, it was a great way of kind of generating discussion and being a little bit provocative. So at the same time, as a business, we were starting to sort of wonder what we could do to improve our business and sort of some initiatives. And we approached a local beekeeper, and he was very happy to install a beehive at the office. And so we've had one there, or had a couple there for about 11 years or so. And there's about 100,000 bees. And we obviously produce our own honey, and it's very successful. And again, it's in a quite prominent spot where it's something all of our clients, visitors come to the building can see from the meeting room, and it's a talking point. So we also created some mini allotments for staff. A lot of our staff are living in sort of small flats, maybe don't have a garden. And again, it was in a position which is quite visible, and it gets people talking about food production and what we could be doing with our green spaces. And we also started to look at our garden more seriously and look at the sort of planting that was there, and could we actually improve it? So we actually took a lot of plants out and replaced them with bee-friendly plants. And so we're sort of starting to see what we could do to have a greater impact. So once we'd done all the things we could do with our own sort of garden space, we started looking beyond that. And this is the promenade, which is directly outside our office, which is kind of near where that big cedar tree is. And, it's a really lovely space, but we thought, it could actually be even better. Could it be better for nature? And we did a proposal which showed, could you actually have a kind of strip of wildflowers running all the way along the length of it? And maybe that could go all the way up to the Downs and link back to the city centre, say like 4 miles long, and it could be like a walking route. And, we know that bees and wildlife sort of travels in lines. So we thought that could be a good proposal, which we wanted to talk to all the neighbouring offices about whether they would want to get on board and support it. Unfortunately, they weren't really up for it. So we ended up doing it ourselves, just in front of our own office in a kind of smaller scale. And I think, this was obviously 10 years ago or so, maybe times have changed since then. So maybe there'd be a bit more support. So it was great. And it's not a very good picture of it, but, it's been quite a successful little strip, which is probably about 20 meters long. And this is actually us a couple of weeks ago in Bristol on the Downs, working with Avon Wildlife Trust to create a whole big area of wildflower meadow. So hopefully this summer we'll see something amazing happen. So as part of kind of Green Weeks, it was all about provoking discussion and getting noticed. And each year we had a different theme. So one year we were talking about wild, and it was all about our kind of position in nature and also looking and appreciating nature around us. And we were lucky that one of our staff used to be a tree surgeon, and he volunteered to climb up and put this tent hanging up there. So it was great because it was right on the main road. So a lot of people saw it and they were wondering what that's about. So it was all about kind of generating discussion about, and also celebrating the beauty of this beautiful old cedar tree. And in another year, we were talking about regeneration and use of old spaces and old buildings. And we approached Redcliffe Caves and said, could we do a series of talks in your space around this? And it was a fantastic evening. As you can see, a really amazing space. And I think just holding it in such an unusual venue, it was really interesting to people. And a lot of people, were keen to come along. And another year, we were talking about transport. And we did a race from Temple Meads up to the office to test all sorts of various forms of transport. I think we had about 10 different types. And again, it was just to kind of generate discussion about, in Bristol, what is the best way to get around, and should we be doing more to promote more sustainable transport? And if you're interested, it was actually the electric bike, which was the fastest, beating the car and the motorbike even, which was really impressive. And actually, it highlighted that there wasn't an option to use the river. And from that, we went and had a discussion with the ferry service, and they decided from that to introduce a commuter service along the river, which was great. Unfortunately, because of the speed that they travel at and are permitted to travel at, it didn't last for very long because it just wasn't quick enough to get people from A to B to be a viable model. And we tried to sort of see if they could influence the river authority to see whether they could kind of get more of a speedy boat, but unfortunately it wasn't possible. But it just shows it's sort of just doing things, things start to trigger and happen from that. Another year we talked about waste, and this was really just a bit of fun. I just absolutely love this picture of exploring what we do with our paper, and had this thing to create paper airplanes. I just think it's amazing that this thing actually flew at that size. And we started to look around our office at all the kind of the recycling and the waste that was being generated. And we thought, could we do a theme around waste and use all of this in a kind of striking way to make something which would make people talk about it? And so we collected all the milk containers and made this sort of sculpture in our garden for all the clients to see. And it was a great bit of fun, really. But again, it was sort of just highlighting all about recycling and doing something which was a bit striking and a bit different. And we used the kind of the material which was used in that construction, in the next year to talk about planting and greening, and did this outside our office. So all of these things in their own small way were having a kind of limited impact on us as a business, but also on the people who came to our office when that's happening. But we reached out and we worked with Business West and a couple of others to actually say, well, what if lots of businesses did this? And we put this pack together to invite others to kind of join in and do similar things. And I think this was in 2014, we had about 90 businesses in Bristol all using the template that we'd generated for each day, including the universities and the BBC. So it felt like there was real momentum there, and it's just that kind of something starting small, gathering pace and gathering momentum. So I've talked quite a bit about sort of us as a business, what we've been doing internally, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our projects now. And this was a project in Somerset in the Levels, and we were thinking about your kind of ordinary house. And what's really interesting from a kind of, if you look at this is in Bradley Stoke, just a pretty conventional set of houses, is that you'll notice is that all of them, pretty much all of them, have a conservatory out the back. And we're thinking that's kind of surely telling you something, that why are they having, everyone's putting a conservatory on? Does that mean that the houses aren't big enough, or they're not light enough, or there's just not a good enough connection to the gardens? So it's sort of saying there's something wrong with the conventional house design if they all need to put this thing on. But the problem with all of these conservatories, as nice as they are, they do tend to overheat in the summer and they get very cold in the winter. So they're actually not great in terms of energy. And we entered this competition and managed to win it for this small housing development in Somerset. And you can see from the kind of terrace on the left-hand side, we were starting to explore how you could incorporate these conservatories or sun spaces in a much more kind of integrated way, which would work in a kind of thermal, sustainable way. And the design was to create a kind of a buffer space which the conservatory would then be two stories, and you could come out from the bedroom upstairs, and it would be a space that kind of the living room opens up onto. So it's like a buffer space between you and the outside, sort of preheating internally. And we explored having a kind of monopitch roof, so you could collect all the rainwater, and all of the residents are now kind of using that to flush their toilets, and also for their washing machines as well. And in front of these, the way these sun spaces work environmentally is that they have openings at the bottom and they have openings at the top. So all the heat, when it gets too warm, can kind of vent out, and it keeps it cooler. But importantly as well, in front of them, we've got a series of timber slats, which mean that you get that low angle winter light in, which is what you want, the sun. But in the summer, because the sun's higher, it cuts it out, so it keeps it shaded. And in the construction of this, we wanted to make sure that we would keep as much of the existing trees and green as possible. So you can see how it really nicely nestles into the setting, and you can see how it's used natural materials as much as possible. And you can see it's a really beautiful setting. And the terrace on the right-hand side being a slightly different orientation, we looked at a different kind of way of doing it. And we had roofs turned the other way so that we could capture the, put PVs on those roofs to capture the sun. And we also looked at what materials we could use for it, as well as the natural materials. There was a house which was being demolished locally, and we managed to salvage all of the old bricks from there. So immediately our building had a kind of character built into it. So this was the end result. And what was really great about the clients who we worked with, who were called ESOS, is that they encouraged us all the way to be adventurous and be different, and really pushed boundaries on what a house should look like. And they knew sort of very cleverly that the more striking the design, the more impact it was going to have. And, you know, we were very keen to sort of explore that as well. We weren't deliberately making it different looking, but we were just sort of exploring the things we wanted to achieve in the design and how that kind of then would affect the appearance. And it created like a lovely garden space in front, which all the residents look after. And it did have a big impact. So there was a lot of publications and a lot of sort of government bodies which started to use it as a case study and explore maybe this is actually how we should be sort of designing our homes. And it had a huge amount of publicity. So really just exactly what the client wanted, because their mission at the time, and this was about in 2008, was to make I think, sustainable construction the norm by 2015. That was their kind of slogan. And it was captured in all sorts of publications. And it was on BBC Breakfast, you know, it was incredible, and lots of coffee table books and things. And you'll see that they all focused in on that left-hand terrace because it was slightly different looking. So the message there is about being sort of capturing people's imagination, I think, and being a little bit different. And I think had those houses been very conventional looking and no one would have noticed them. They wouldn't have paid any attention. But because we were sort of going back to Karen and Lucas's quote, sort of imagining a more positive future, people were kind of standing up and taking notice. So on the back of that, we started to kind of explore other ways of making houses, and we came up with a concept for a competition that we entered in Letchworth Garden City. Was, could you actually make a house all from grown materials? So obviously that's, you know, very, you know, be a very good thing in terms of sustainability. And we used a lot of the principles from that previous scheme about the kind of sun space on the front, but we put a big trellis in front of it and decided how we could actually use that as a way of growing plants all the way up it. But could we make it out of hemp and timber? Could we put a green roof on it? And you know, how those that kind of greening of the front could really sell the fact that it's a garden city house, because it was for Letchworth. It was like a prototype, and we sort of developed the design. It was going to have solar PVs, etc. And we managed to win the competition out of about 80 international entries, which was amazing. And these are the houses being built. So that's hemp, the construction of it on the left-hand side. So it's all purely, completely natural, completely breathable, and the rest is sort of, and then it's rendered over and a mixture of timber. So it was a really exciting project. And that idea of using natural materials and sort of generating, being a bit provocative, is something we explored with our own office as well. So we had an opportunity to design our office in Cardiff, and we decided to make it all out of timber, which back sort of 10 years ago was really quite unusual for an office. And again, it captured a lot of sort of media attention. And today, you know, it's a really great office to be in, and it works really well environmentally, and it's sort of carbon neutral in operation, which of its time, it was one of the greenest offices, maybe the greenest office in the UK. And there was, after that, a whole series of projects and houses which we looked at, trying to kind of maybe push the boundaries a little bit and do things a little bit differently, and also explore that whole kind of orientation, looking at it in terms of that. And this was a house proposal for north of Bristol, where we came up with this idea of a kind of wraparound roof, which was a sort of opening out to the sun and to the south, and then closing down to the north in a kind of sheltering way. So you can see the picture on the north where it's a lot more closed down, so we're losing less heat. But to the south, you've actually got a triple story sun space all the way up to the top, and again with shading and ventilation at the top. So they were very popular, and you know, it was a great project to work on. And again, the client was really welcoming of something which was a little bit different, because he could see the power of that being a kind of strong concept and capturing people's imagination. And we looked at a series of other different houses which were kind of, again, pushing the boundaries a little bit. Some of these were built, some were just sort of testing ideas and competition entries. So that idea of trying to push the boundaries a little bit in terms of sustainability, I had the opportunity to build my own house. And so this was kind of a way of looking at how I could do something in Bath. This was the existing plot with a really beautiful house that you can see here. But on a really fantastic plot. And so could I do something which was really kind of exploring how you could do it as sustainably as possible? And you can see from the back, it was a shambles of a kind of garden, you know, complete mess. but a really sunny aspect. So what could we do in Bath, which was sort of in keeping, but would actually be maybe not sort of a traditional house, but pushing the boundaries a little bit. So one of the things we did was try and retain all of the materials from the old house and reuse them. So this was all the Bath stone being kind of collected, and all the rubble from the house, all the kind of base stone we reused in the garden, and all the timber we saved. And we used that, all the floorboards up at the top there, to create a shed. So it's all clad in the floorboards. And the garden itself was an absolute mess whilst it was being constructed, because we wanted to retain as much of the material on site. But so after that, and over the process of the next kind of 7 or 8 years, I very slowly sort of worked on that garden to kind of get it back to an attractive garden and be a kind of food producing garden. So that's the end result up in Lincoln. So trying to grow as much of food as possible. So on the roof there, you can see at the top, that's solar panels, but built into the roof. So they're solar sort of PV tiles. And then you've got a series of 6 roof lights and 6 solar thermal panels, which give us about 50% of our hot water. So that we're reusing all of the stone, added with some new stone, and that south facade really opens up. So we can get lots of good ventilation, and in the winter we get a lot of nice sun coming through there. We capture all of the rainwater from both of the roofs, so we have storage for about 2,500 litres, which helps with the garden and be used for that. And there's another picture of the roof. So that, you know, these tiles, there's lots of different ones like this. These are all ones that could be being used in Bath as a very kind of sympathetic way of doing something which isn't like a solar panel just stuck on the roof. And trying to design the garden as much as possible for nature. And there's a kind of feature up at the top of the house, which is all about bouncing light into the house to maximize the amount of kind of solar gain that we get in winter, but it also creates this really beautiful kind of mirror effect of the water outside. So that's all looking at kind of buildings. At the same time, we were starting to kind of think about having an impact on a bigger scale, so on a city scale. And it was fantastic. Bristol became the European Green Capital in 2015. And during that year, we did something in the office every week of the year. So we had a talk or an event, and we split up the whole year in terms of different themes. And so we were kind of trying to get as involved as possible. And the kind of outcome of that, once that was all over, we thought, well, we did all these really interesting things. It would be a shame if that was just all then done and forgotten. What if we capture all of that and turn it into a book? So we kind of created 52 big ideas for Bristol. And that was a kind of a series of provocations to have discussions and start to influence the city in a small way. And it was really well received. And there were there was a number of ideas which kind of had some momentum and had some influence, hopefully. And one of the ideas was called Bristol Colour Capital. And it was, well, it's not really our idea, but it was sort of just looking at all of the colourful houses which was happening around the city. And it's really quite a phenomenon that Bristol is, you know, in a nice way, so sort of different from Bath, which is very much about one colour, one material. And we wanted to generate a discussion about why it was happening and what is the effect of it. And we held an event where we brought together the council, the tourist board, architects, residents, the community, and we asked the question, what effect is this having? And kind of what the real sort of, I suppose, discussion points were about the impact it was having on people's well-being, seeing all of this colour, and also the effect on value of the streets, and the effect on the perception of safety. And so it's amazing the kind of difference that doing these things can actually have on a place. And it's something that I'm really kind of excited to see has taken off in Gloucester as well. So there's an artist there called Tasha Fruitco, and she almost single-handedly is sort of transforming parts of Gloucester. She's an artist and a property owner, and she's knocking on the doors and persuading whole streets to start painting their streets from this very grey, drab existing state to these amazing multicolored spaces. And that's her, and she's just doing these kind of incredible things, and she's creating murals as well, and it's having a massive impact on those whole communities. So from one person, you can actually sort of, just by pushing it and speaking to people and winning people over, you can have this incredible effect. And I put on this as an example. This, I can't remember exactly where it is, but it's from South America, where there are sort of areas which have been historically known for crime and lots of antisocial behavior. And they brought in artists and made this complete transformation, and it's having sort of really positive impact on the whole perception of that place. So we started as well looking at other parts of the city and how we could sort of improve them. So Castle Park in the centre of Bristol is a great space, but it has lots of negatives to it. It feels quite unsafe. There are lots of areas which aren't particularly looked after, don't feel very welcoming, and maybe pretty underused. And we put together this proposal looking at this large winter garden space and how we could sort of really improve parts of the park and maybe incorporate affordable housing and lots of other aspects, and how we could generate energy. And we had meetings with council, and it was very positive and they were very interested, but unfortunately there were other things already happening in the park and other proposals for it. So we kind of maybe sort of slightly missed the boat on that. But what we were able to have an influence on was down at Paintworks. So we managed to win a mini competition to do phase 3 of Paintworks. And our concept for that was, it was a great sort of good chunk of the city, was the previous proposals for that area were very car dominated and they weren't a very nice space. And what we suggested was, what if we lift up the kind of whole development and we put the cars underneath and we kind of ramp up to it and we wrap it completely with shops and houses, so that it creates this whole pedestrian environment above it. And you can see from the picture on the left, the kind of size of the streets is now suddenly designed for people instead of for cars. And that sort of makes a massive difference. It means you can make a much nicer space. You can suddenly introduce planting, and it becomes a place sort of for people, and it creates a sense of community. You can get to know your neighbours. And the planners were very concerned initially about the proximity of the houses and whether they would be sort of looking onto it, but the residents haven't been concerned about that at all. And if you think about all of the historic old cities that we love visiting in Europe, they all have narrow streets. So we've become accustomed to designing streets for motor cars, basically, the kind of proportions of them. And it's meant that where we've had a public space, that they've been able to use that for kind of picnics and community events and everything. Just conscious of time. So thinking about that kind of having an impact and greening spaces, we also were entering competitions, and this was a competition for a business park. I can't remember, somewhere up north, and they wanted to kind of transform it. But I mean, as you can see from the picture, it's very sterile. It's completely kind of road dominated. It's got these big sort of slab blocks, and we weren't quite sure of the kind of scale of ambition that they were looking at. But what we suggested, that they need to think really big. So what we suggested is take out all of those road spaces, create a kind of central parking area in that building, which we've kind of converted or proposed converting on the left-hand side, put as much solar on all the roofs, put food growing on the main roof of that main building, and everywhere else create this whole rewilded landscape, which would be full of paths, for people, planting and water, and be this really attractive space, which we thought was a great idea, but we didn't get shortlisted. So, but we did have a bit more success in Letchworth again. So they had a competition for about a 900 home master plan. And it was to sort of think about the Garden City principles and updating them for today, and look at how we could design neighborhoods in a way which was more sustainable. And again, picking up on the theme of neighborhoods being pretty much designed for cars and being sort of road dominated, we wanted to challenge that. And we came up with this concept of the whole kind of bigger community being linked by this big green linear park, which would be the kind of connection to everything. And then breaking off of that would be a series of little mini communities, each around a green space. And a bit like a kind of our kind of concept, you can just maybe make it out at the bottom, is a bit like a kind of a branch with leaves coming off it. So all of those little communities around were kind of different sorts of green space. So this was an example of one of them where you'd get a little mini community, and it would be grouped around. So there would be cars, but they would be sort of downplayed. But it would create this little mini green space in the middle of the community, which would be a facility for everyone. And it would also have like an area for play, but an area for communal dining and eating and socializing, and like a little mini building which would have a space where the sort of shared car and shared tools, shared library, and all of those other things could take place. And we suggested maybe instead of the kind of growing always being out of the street in your back gardens that no one sees, why don't we put all the greenhouses in the middle of the street? And we also create spaces in front of the houses for food growing as well. And out of about 95 international entries, we were runner-up. So unfortunately, we didn't quite win it, but it did. It actually won the people's vote. So kind of galling that it didn't win. So over to Bath now. And I've been sort of working in Bath for quite some time now. I'm really passionate about the city. So like, how can we do some of these more kind of provocative things in Bath, and what sort of things could they be? And there was an opportunity back in 2015, there was a competition called Imagine Bath, and it was just an open ideas competition for the city. And what struck me was about the city is that it's a spa city, but there's very little water celebrated in the city, you know, despite being a spa city and all of our neighbors celebrating water. And I suggested maybe we could have like a network of fountains around it in all the public spaces, and just completely transform the kind of look and the feel of the city, and the sight and sound of water being everywhere, and the kind of whole history being celebrated. And very fortunate that that was the winning entry. And I've been sort of trying ever since then to try and make it happen, which, you know, I'm not giving up yet, but we'll see what happens. So maybe you'll all be familiar with Bath skyline. And we knew at the time, this was a few years ago, that the council was looking at the whole river corridor, and they were looking at how to improve it, and there was a kind of master plan. And we were sort of musing about the fact that the skyline is so popular, it's such a great walking route. Why doesn't the kind of river corridor become almost like a sister version of it? And we suggested the idea of, or the name, the Bath River Line, which amazingly the council really liked, and they've kind of taken that on board as an idea. So that's happening at the moment, and you know, there's some really amazing proposals sort of coming forward to kind of make that a much better space along the river, so much more not you know, the development sort of traditionally turned its back on the river, so it's really making it a special space in the city. And when we conceived of the idea, we sort of thought about like a series of events or kind of pit stops along it. And again, the council really liked that kind of idea of these things happening along it, and they turned it into this idea of like a tube map, which I think works really well. And there's really exciting proposals that they're developing coming forward for it. And then a few years ago, we were very interested in the whole history of Bath and how Georgian Bath developed, and that people came to Bath to enjoy the hot springs and the baths, but it was also a place that they came to kind of be outside, be in nature, be walking, and that was all part of kind of taking the cure, was the whole city being as a place for health. And so it was really kind of designed as a resort, and there are loads of great talks coming up at BRLSI talking about that whole kind of area, which I'm not an expert on. But we wondered whether that whole concept could be brought up to date, and looking at the city as a kind of therapy. So the language they used was that the landscape around Bath was a therapeutic landscape. And we proposed this idea of a therapeutic city, asking the question, what could we do with the city today to kind of make it good for mind, body, and soul? And we had a whole series of talks and events sort of over a week. And in the kind of planning of that, we were talking to the council, and I think we both kind of collectively come to the observation at the same time that it overlapped with International Car Free Day. And we thought, wouldn't it be great to shut down Milsom Street for the weekend and take all the cars out and kind of be a bit provocative and speak to all the shopkeepers and the businesses to say, can you manage without cars in front of you for a couple of days? And I think there was some nervousness from some saying, well, we rely on this business, do we not? We need the car parking space. But actually, most of them were on board. And then that happens, and they're obviously kind of won over. And I know this is still part of a kind of journey in terms of making Milsom Street as active as possible. But we were incredibly fortunate with the weather, but it was phenomenally successful. And it just shows kind of, if you can give spaces over to people, how fantastic it can be. And obviously the kind of the sales and everything else that they managed to do from that event way exceeded a conventional day. So getting onto a project called Sinking House, which some of you may have seen, that came about from something which was called Climate Action Reload, which was our business leading up to COP26, wanted to do a series of events kind of culminating up in Glasgow with COP26. So all of our offices would therefore, the idea was they would sort of hold a week's worth of talks and events. And we joined up with the practice in Belfast and in Glasgow. And it was great. And it generated a whole load of discussion. And so when it came to Bath and thinking about what we could do in Bath, I wanted it not just to be a series of talks, to do something a bit more kind of engaging and really kind of capture people that we wouldn't normally have an audience with. And I was looking at sort of where you could do something which would really have an impact. And it has to be somewhere where lots of people would see it. And if we chose somewhere which was really iconic and special and beautiful, maybe it would capture people's imagination, and that kind of whole message would go beyond just the people who saw it within Bath. So we kind of started thinking about using the space in front of Pulteney Bridge, and could we actually put something in the river? So the kind of themes that we were thinking about was, obviously it had to send a message about COP26, and we wanted it to be striking enough that it would kind of be seen, and maybe in a very kind of hopeful way, that the politicians would get that message that they really had to act at COP26. And we knew about Greta Thunberg's speech that she did, which was all about our house is on fire, which was really powerful. And then at the same time, that kind of summer, all in the news, there was floods in Europe and people kind of stranded on their houses. So, and everyone's familiar with the kind of iconic pictures of pile of polar bears being stranded on icebergs. So could we do something which kind of picked up on those themes and that idea of floating a house, which was kind of representing a house which was floating downstream, but also a house as in the world, was something that we explored. And we worked with format engineers who are on Walcott Street, who are brilliant engineers and do amazing work all around the world to kind of look at how we could float a timber structure temporarily and loop it round one of the arches to the bridge. And as you can imagine, there were all sorts of kind of challenges and permissions that we needed to get, which we thought we would constantly be falling at. But amazingly, sort of Sarah Warren pretty early on said, I think this is a great idea. And you know, lots of people we spoke to said, this sounds fantastic, so keep going. So we did. And so we started sort of building this structure with a chimney. And this is one of my colleagues working with an artist, Anna Gillespie, who's a great local artist who does lots of kind of environmental work. And in her studio, sort of modeling for this person who was sitting on the top, and she really kind of brought it to life, the whole piece. And it was a great kind of team effort with Fifield Moss, who were the carpenters, and they built this whole kind of structure up at the Bath Scouts, which is further up the river. And it was a real technical challenge to make this thing which would float and be just the right sort of weight and everything else. And it was quite exciting to see it kind of being floated downstream and then positioned, and it was there for about 3 weeks. And the impact it had just sort of completely exceeded our kind of wildest dreams, in that it was covered all around the world in terms of kind of media exposure. So all of those countries on the left had pictures of it in their newspapers, and many of the national newspapers covered it as well. And it was, you know, hugely on social media, and, you know, it won numerous awards as well. So it was just that kind of idea of doing something a bit different, a bit provocative, had the kind of impact that we wanted, which was to raise awareness of what was happening. And all of these companies and organizations locally were involved in making it happen. So it was definitely not just us, and it couldn't have happened without all the kind of generosity and goodwill of a lot of these organizations. So I think that, for me, proves there is a huge appetite for change and for doing something positive. So it's just kind of galvanizing that. So kind of on to the last sort of stage of the talk. And recently I was very lucky to be invited to be part of an event that Bath Bid organised as part of the launch of the Wellbeing Festival. And they were talking, we'd already met with them talking about the idea of Bath as a well-being city, which I've kind of covered a little bit about, talking about the therapeutic city. And they invited us to kind of explore this theme further and do a public talk about it. And it's all back to kind of what I was talking about before, this Bath as a sort of spa landscape, and how we could maybe create a vision for, say, 2030 of Bath as this well-being city, which could then be sort of looking at well-being today and sustainability, and could be a real exemplar. And again, you know, back to what I mentioned before about how the city used to be a place which is designed with all its parks and green spaces to be a place where people exercise and we're out in nature. So all of these things are very relevant today. So we kind of put this vision together of Bath as a kind of exemplary, healthy city for the year 2030, and kind of imagining, you know, articles in the paper saying you should come to Bath and this is how fantastic it is. And so it's that kind of starting at the end and then working back to how we're going to get there. And we suggested that, unfortunately, I think there's some text missing there underneath all the pictures, but there were 10 themes, each looking at kind of a different way of Bath being this sort of exemplary well-being city, you know, from memory, it was all about sort of water, greening, transport, exercise, sort of coming together in events, warm, sustainable homes, food, play, relaxation, and sort of sensory gardens. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about two things today, so water and greening. And so much as in the kind of the waters of Bath concept idea, we kind of explored that a little bit further. And so all of this is on our website if you want to listen to the talk which we recorded, which explores this all in more detail. So we proposed, we showed a little bit more about how this could look, and you know, imagine coming out of Bath Spa Station, the sense of arriving in a spa city. There's water immediately which greets you, and it creates immediately that kind of sense of relaxation and telling that story of Bath as a kind of spa city, and how all around the city that these kind of water features suddenly create this ambiance, this this feeling of well-being all around the city, and particularly as sort of climate warms up, this would really help keep the city cool in the summers, which are obviously going to be getting hotter and hotter. And I've obviously kind of skipped a whole load here, but I'm going to kind of concentrate on two main things. So one of the ideas that we put together was looking at this space here, so Bog Island, but also Parade Gardens. We put together a fairly kind of outrageous idea, which we're meeting the council with in a week. And so we'll see how this goes. So looking at Bog Island, it's obviously pretty car dominated. It's got the buses, which isn't great because you've got all of the space below it, which is, you know, they're all sort of supporting that, all of that weight from those buses. And you've got underneath there this space which used to be public toilets and a nightclub, which hasn't been used for 30 odd years, and all of the openings up onto the park, which could be great, you know, it could be improving that park, they've all been closed, and there's probably many reasons why that is. But we sort of suggested, well, what if you take out all of the cars from that space and you create a kind of glass structure over those openings, which then bring light down and create a kind of new entrance into that space below. And that could be a little bit like the Louvre in Paris, where you've got this sort of glass pyramid, and suddenly it creates, from what is a sort of fairly dark space below where the cellars are, this whole new bright, welcoming environment. And that could be the new entrance to Parade Gardens, this sort of exciting arrival space, a little bit also like, and the glass could be quite, the glass structure could be quite sculptural. This is a gin distillery in Sussex, I think. So, you know, it could be really exciting and sculptural. And what that would do is it would open up all of those entrances onto the park, and suddenly, you know, you could have a cafe space, you could have all sorts of events, you could start to look at that landscaping of the park, which is really pretty sterile, really. It's quite kind of ornamental. It's not doing a lot for biodiversity. It could be this amazing sort of landscape with the cafe popping out into it. But this is kind of almost the precursor to the main idea, which is that we think there's a massive opportunity which hasn't been looked at. And it's only really kind of become possible because a couple of years ago, they made it possible, this is Borough Happold, to take the heat from the Roman bars and that hot water which flows out of them and flows through the park and into the river. They've managed to extract heat from that to do the underfloor heating to the Abbey. But and that's been phenomenally successful. But what that's proved is that the technology is there to do that, but that's only happening for 3-4 months of the year. What's happening to all of that heat for the rest of the year? And that heat, even speaking to Borough Happold, when it's heated up the Abbey floor, it's still very hot when it comes out. So it's not even using all of the heat. And that's because you get 1.3 million litres of hot water running through that area every single day. So it's a huge amount of heat that's just flowing into the river unused through these passages and then through a pipe going through Parade Gardens. So what we suggested is that we could create a new hot water bathing area in the park. And unlike Thermae and the all of the kind of exclusive hotels, this can be something for everyone in Bath. So it could be very affordable, it could be very family orientated, and it's in a stunning location here, right next to the weir, and it could be using a space in the park, which is not very intensively used at the moment, and we could certainly improve the whole landscaping. And what it would also do is help sort of regenerate the opportunity to reuse the colonnades next door as well. And there's all sorts of opportunities could it tie into with the rugby ground opposite, which is obviously kind of looking at their proposals and the whole re-landscaping of the riverside edge. So there's great opportunities to do something which is really quite exciting. And so we've got a meeting with the council next week about that. And we do know that they are kind of interested in that whole riverside area. So it feels like there could be a good moment, a good opportunity, a window in time to do something a bit different. And yeah, this was prepared by Barrow Happel just to show kind of the positive regenerative qualities it could have on all the surrounding area. So that's one idea. So I'm going to now kind of conclude with some ideas about greening the city. And we, as part of that kind of whole well-being initiative, we put together some ideas, one of which was, could you introduce a whole series of planters which sneak away and sneak through the streets, almost in kind of green trails, like little miniature parks running along through the city. And all of these could be sponsored and looked after by local businesses. And maybe the council could introduce a policy where all businesses and shops have to introduce planters outside their premises and sort of encourage them to green them up. And, you know, imagine between that and the other idea, just the whole kind of transformational effect it could have on the whole city. And we suggest as well, maybe they, and it's quite possible they are kind of looking at these things, but the idea of mapping the city for opportunities for tree planting. We know there are sellers, we know it's challenging, but there must be technical solutions in this day and age to kind of maximize the opportunity of tree cover. And we suggested that local businesses could sponsor them, local schools could look after them and adopt them. And we also suggested maybe nature in all its forms around the city could be celebrated, and we could involve artists in terms of kind of making it fun and sort of highlighting how beautiful nature is. And, you know, I just love all these different examples around the world where they're doing that sort of thing. And maybe there's an opportunity as well to sort of start to map where there are blank facades around the city, and are there opportunities to do green walls? And you can imagine the kind of transformational effect that would have on the city in certain parts of it, to really kind of make it more feel like a garden. And there's probably whole areas on the city on the outskirts where we could be greening them up much more. And this is what's happening in other cities. This is Sheffield, where they've got this initiative called Grey to Green, where they're sort of taking up whole parts of the city and introducing wildlife-friendly planting. And you can just see the kind of transformational effect it's having. And I've certainly seen other cities where they're involving the community and looking after that, those sort of spaces. So it's not all on the council and a kind of huge burden on them to look after it, but if we can involve the community to kind of look after it and plant it, you know, imagine the kind of the effect on the city if we were doing these sorts of things. And we suggested we could maybe challenge some of the kind of what some of the architecture could be like. Could we, like this place, which is up in Leeds, which is a cancer centre, really kind of explore how you could incorporate greening into some of the proposals coming forward. And we suggested that this could be a new kind of health centre, something like this in the centre of the city. You know, how great would that be? but maybe let's not just stop there. Let's maybe make whole kind of neighborhoods of this. Maybe we know there are plans being considered for kind of around the Locksbrook area to improving that whole area. Could we actually create like a whole nature neighborhood, and with offices and with housing, create this amazing kind of completely transformational space, which would be good for nature and be good for air quality, and we think could generate some really high property values, which would help fund affordable housing. So the last idea I'm going to talk about is kind of a little bit of a big idea, and it's kind of come about some of my own interest in biodiversity and reading some of these books, some of which you might have come across before. So Wilding on the left-hand side was written by the person who's done Net Farm, which I mentioned right at the start, where they're doing these interesting things about rewilding the landscape. And the thing that I kind of learned from all of these books is that nature's not in a great place at the moment in terms of the UK. And some of you might have seen the Wild Isles documentary on or series on Sunday evening. So we're really kind of not in a great position in the UK, and there's so much more we could be doing. And a lot of that, all of these sort of interventions I've been talking about this evening have been either very small scale in offices or kind of in the city. We need to be thinking bigger than that. We need to be thinking about the kind of land use and farms and the whole kind of areas of the countryside. And where nature really thrives and does well is on a big scale. So it needs space to kind of it needs that kind of, it can't work in small pockets. It needs space to kind of have that area for sort of regenerating itself. And we as people, we also need wild spaces, and that's great for our mental health as well. So there's the idea was around Bath and around much of the UK, we have a lot of this sort of space, which is, it's very attractive. It's green space. It's probably all green belt, but it's not actually great for wildlife. So it's a bit of a monoculture. You can just see the sheep in the corner there. It's just really grass. There's not a lot happening for nature. What if we actually transformed it into this sort of space? You can just see how great that is going to be for nature. And I know, this is a whole different kind of model, and it's going to be very challenging to do this to large parts of land, but there are other opportunities in terms of our kind of watercourses to rewild them and make them much more attractive to nature. And you can kind of just see with the shallow banks that they're going to be, much better for biodiversity and also for flooding as well, because those spaces are going to soak up when there is flooding. They're going to kind of, rather than channel the water down very fast, they're going to absorb that water. And you can still have these sort of spaces, but still farm them, which is what NEP is proving. And the animals are really part of that kind of natural system. So they're turning over the soil, they're making spaces which are damp, which are good for nature. And the success of that farm is absolutely incredible in terms of the number of species that they have and the number of species which have been very threatened locally, but are now absolutely thriving in those locations. And they're creating this whole kind of mosaic of habitat as opposed to the kind of monoculture of habitat. And it's great for people as well. I mean, I don't think this one's from NEP, but that idea of a kind of rewilded landscape is much more captivating for people. And people love getting out into nature, and it means we can kind of connect to nature if you have those sort of inspiring places. And we can also spend more time in them. And the pictures on the right are from NEP, where you can stay overnight. And, you can see they're pretty magical spaces. And it's great for learning opportunities as well, and sort of engaging school children in nature at the same time. So this is what they're doing. And so you can see on the left what it was and what it's sort of turning into, which looks very alien for the UK, well, particularly for England, but it's very exciting. And I'm sort of thinking, could we do something like this in Bath? So, looking at Bath and thinking about the nature that we have already, and we're very fortunate that we do have a lot of green space and we're surrounded by a lot of green, but a lot of that is sort of farmland, which is kind of like the first picture I showed, which can be quite sterile. We do have lots of good stuff going on. So this is from the council's website, which shows kind of pockets of protected areas of nature. But as you can see, it's very fragmented. And we know that when nature thrives, it does so when it's connected and when it's bigger. So that idea of kind of green corridors where wildlife from very small to large can kind of run and move works much better. So much like in these examples, that idea of a kind of a green corridor which wildlife can move along, which can be kind of imposed in a more conventionally farmed landscape, would be also very successful. So this is the pitch to you. The idea of a looping nature reserve around the city. And I know this has a lot of work to do. We need to speak to lots of people about it, but there is this idea is sort of, we're calling it Bath Wildline on the basis that you've got the Bath skyline, you've got the Bath River line. What about a wild version? So this becomes part of that kind of almost trilogy of walking opportunities. So it's a walking route. It's using public footpaths, but the area immediately around it gets rewilded. So you're getting this opportunity to experience this kind of wilder landscape. And to test it, I walked it a couple of weeks ago. So the green line is the route that I chose. And then the orange line is my kind of very initial stab at the kind of area of land that you could engage with landowners and farmers to explore whether that area could be farmed and managed for nature. And I know that area is going to change a lot, but it all stems from this idea of wild belt, which is an idea that the Wildlife Trust came up with a year or two ago. And so that turns that area from green belt into wild belt. And what they're doing is they're trying to argue that we need a new planning designation because green belt is just not doing enough for nature. So they're talking about wild belts being a new kind of planning designation. And they've also got a campaign going 30 by 30. So they want 30% of our land to be turned to nature by 2030. So it's a really strong and ambitious proposal. And you might think, well, that's too wildly ambitious. But the Welsh government have signed up to it. So, it gives you hope that with the right leadership, we could really sign up to this. And there's lots of things happening in the background. So the government is encouraging farmers there's all sorts of incentive schemes to look at their land to improve it for nature. There's a local nature recovery scheme and there's a landscape recovery scheme. This is all well out of my kind of background depth, but the limited amount of research I've done into it shows that there are lots of incentives that could be used financially to encourage landowners to take a strip of their land out of kind of conventional farming and into a more nature positive sort of management. And if we did all of this, we know it would be great for people as well to experience that landscape. We all need nature. We all need to have access to wildness. And what's great about Bath is it's of a scale that we could walk into that area, within 45 minutes from anywhere in the city. So we're of such a great scale that this kind of loop idea really works. And it could be, I think, like a UK first if we did it. And what a great template and model for other towns and cities. And it's kind of taking that net strategy of rewilding and looking at it on a kind of city scale from a country scale. And there does seem to be a lot of kind of political will to embrace this idea of rewilding. And this is from Whereas website, where they're talking about they want to protect 11,000 hectares of land by 2030 for nature. And they want to kind of reverse the decline in nature, and they want Bath to be nature positive by 2030. And they want to engage with farmers and landowners for nature recovery and biodiversity net gain. So it sounds like, well, they must be in support of this, which sounds really encouraging. And we have already, we've got some meetings lined up with the National, well, we've met with the National Trust already, and we're hopefully meeting with the council soon. And I'll explain in a second who else we're meeting with. But if you look at the council's website, this area here is called Ecological Network. And I've only really started kind of looking at this in more detail, so I'm not exactly sure what that means. But it certainly sounds positive, as in it would fit with their policies. And as I've said, we've already met with the National Trust, and who own potentially part of that strip, and they love it as an idea, so they're really on board. And I've got a meeting with the Avon Wildlife Trust on Thursday, and we're meeting Transition Bath on Friday, and we've got a meeting with the council coming out soon. And we've met with Coombe Grove Hotel, who love it as well, and they want to be part of it. And all of these on the right-hand side are all other organisations who we think would be very supportive and very powerful, and would be ones that we want to have a conversation with about it. And I mentioned before the programme, do watch it on Sunday evenings, called The Wild Isles, and they're really highlighting about the kind of the state that the UK is in terms of nature. And what's really exciting is that National Trust, WWF and RSPB have got together, and they've come up with this campaign saying we need to be doing much more. So I'm hoping this idea would really kind of fit in with that. And they've got this website, do have a look at it, called Save Our Wild Isles. And I'm just going to play you now a minute's video that they produced, which is really powerful, which shows what it's all about.
In my lifetime, wildlife in Britain and Ireland has seen devastating declines.
The reality is that actually we're one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world.
Nature underpins everything that makes our lives possible.
The food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe.
If we are to save what we have left, we must act now. Whether you are an individual, a community, a business leader, or a politician,
We need hands on deck.
Everyone, everywhere can do something to help restore nature.
Nature is yours, nature is everybody's.
this starts and ends with us.
So do have a look at it. It looks like it's going to be a really good series. So my last slide, just in conclusion, I would encourage anyone who's a designer to design to be impactful. So it's not just about, think about the kind of audience you might be able to have if you think sort of more visionary. All of us can inspire action through what we do. And Thinking House showed how kind of together, being collaborative, we can achieve really great things. Exploring the temporary, so for example, Milsom Street, doing something for a short space of time can change hearts and minds. And don't wait to be asked. So like the wind turbine proposal, you know, a lot of these sort of things, they don't come along, you have to make them happen. And imagine a positive future. I think, you know, like some of these ideas for Bath, it's about showing people how good things could be. So it's trying to make something which is really appealing that people want to buy into. And in conclusion, we're all influencers, from however small it is to whether we're protesting, we can all make a difference. Thank you very much.